the orthodoxy of the rule of law presumes that you have an illiterate population which can go to court. You have a justice system where the courts are manned by clearly qualified attorneys, and that it's accessible to every human being in any nation, which is not the case within the African context in many places, even the most developed court systems in Africa. So when we talk about the rule of law, it is a rule of law basically for the government, for the executive. It's a rule of law for the powerful people who can use the power of the judiciary to implement whatever they want. And certainly in the African case, the rule of law is closely tied to corruption and corrupt practices within the state, where the state is immune from any forms of the rule of law, and they will always create legal regimes to append the law or to throw it on the side so that they can do whatever they want. Of course, you know, there is a famous saying where the state has the monopoly of violence over its citizens, but that amount of violence that we see in Africa exercised by the state is not proportional to what is written in the constitution or written in the legislated acts. And you can see that we still have a lot of fighting going on in different parts of Africa. People are disappointed. And in fact, as a matter of choice, most military coups, 110 that I have described in my other book, coup d'etats have been supported by the population. Even recently, we've seen the coups in Africa that happened over the last 3 months had civic support because the executive refused to listen to the people who supposedly elected them into the office. So the rule of law is some kind of a quandary that you cannot explain within the African context. When you go to even the developed nations, they have ways and means of bending the rule of law to only benefit the powerful politically and financially. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. It's good that you also made mention of that to help people understand that when we are talking of the law, it's not be it or it's not that it is finished. It's an experiment that is still ongoing. And of course, the one we have in Africa seems to be a little funny, like you have just described, you know. So we can cite case after case in Africa, no, where it is very difficult to bend the law for the interest of the people, but it is very, very easy to bend it for the interest of those who are ruling, which make it easy to actually abuse the people. To that point, I'm trying to wonder the law that we have there in Africa, because I know you have made mention of it that there are laws that are coming from outside, no? Because it's not like the local people were sort of consulted to see how they can be governed, no? Because currently we are talking also with traditional rulers in Africa to try and understand. Let's purge ourselves. Let's try to understand the system that we are even into, because we can see that the elected officials have failed us. But we didn't just start with the elected official. For example, Nigeria is celebrating 61 years of independence. That is the history of Nigeria as amalgamated in 1914. But that is not the history of the people that made up Nigeria. We've been living for thousands of years. If we are having trouble, we're continuously having trouble, we try this little work, let's try something. Let's try to ask ourselves, are there other ways that this thing can function? So where I'm actually going with this is the law that we have that is operating in Africa, is it according to how you have described it? Or they are just laws that are there to sort of favor the colonialists so that when they were leaving Africa, they sort of left people there to continue to represent them. In this case, it becomes very easy for them to do what they have always done. But to do what the people want to be done according to the law, it is difficult. The laws that we have in Africa, are they based on the African experience, based on the people, what the people want? or based on some few individuals for them to be able to run the system for some other persons? That is what I'm trying to understand.
Well, you see, the legal regimes in Africa, the modern legal regimes, are the ones that have been written or copied from colonial powers. Basically, the sense of the law, for example, if you see the Constitution of San Marino, which is, I think, having an election very soon, is considered to be the oldest constitution. And then you have the US Constitution, which informed, of course, the United Nations Charter in terms of its Bill of Rights. So these legal regimes are carbon copy of developed nations. But the problem with this is that it didn't take into account the social anthropological basis of lawmaking. And this debate has been going on for a long period of time. In fact, the lawyers might not like it, that the fact that you have sociological information coming in there, but there are also lawyers, very bright lawyers, who are advocating for changing the legal regimes within Africa. Take democracy, for example. The only thing that we exercise in Africa as a democracy are elections. You don't talk about civic education. You don't talk about the development of a political culture that democracy requires. And also, we don't have the requisite basis to be able to implement this. So what you see is we always have regular elections, and the incumbents, which have tremendous amount of resources, government funds, government vehicles, government offices, they control literally everything, where they deny the opposition any form of participation, where the opposition is completely bankrupt to a point where they don't have any resources to even go and campaign. And this kind of democracy is being parachuted from the West into African communities. And nobody is talking about the kind of political culture development that's necessary for democracy to happen. Whether we like it or not, we had forms of democracy in Africa where you have egalitarian societies who manage their own affairs through their own legal regimes. But we have had also kingdoms that were very brutal in our history. So if we're going to emerge into the 21st century and accept what has become a global governance style called democracy, especially after the end of the Cold War. In fact, some American authors had the audacity to say to call it the end of history, that we're not going to live in any ideological world anymore. And therefore, if that is the case, then we have to have the fundamental basis for democracy to happen to all people. But African leaders and political pundits and the elite are using any part of democracy as a vehicle for them to be in the seat of government. And of course, the international community would always demand that elections have to be undertaken on time. Election observers will always come, but behind the scenes, you don't even know what really happens. Ruling parties in Africa have been seen to distribute the voting cards themselves to those people who are going to vote for them. We've seen ruling parties that have denied economic benefits to populations they believe they will not vote for them. And therefore, with this kind of intimidation and voting tactics, you cannot say everything is free and fair. Some countries have emerged from this, but very often what's really happening in the African context is when you have a corrupt regime, people hate them so much that eventually they go to vote them out. They're not voting for the economic, social, and political policies of even the opposition that's coming into government. They're voting to get the existing incumbent out. So this is not also a unique African quality. We've seen populists in Europe who've been jumping on immigration policies, on terrorism policies, especially after the Syrian war, where millions of Syrians went into Europe, where countries like Hungary and Poland saw their population being overwhelmed with other forms of religion, since they consider themselves as a religious state and not secular state.